In Revelation chapter 13, we are introduced to two different beasts, one that comes up out of the sea and one that comes up out of the earth. And there is no doubt that the second one, the one that comes up out of the earth, is the one that is referring to the Antichrist figure, which later on in the book of Revelation, he is also called the false prophet. And we're going to take a close-up look at this earth beast and what it says about him. But there is so much information and detail surrounding the first beast that we didn't have enough time to look at everything related to that yet. So just to set the scene again, in the previous chapter, Revelation chapter 12, it ends with the dragon standing on the sand of the seashore, and he's filled with great wrath. And his wrath was directed at the woman that gave birth to the male child, but the woman escaped into the wilderness, and the dragon cannot get to her. The dragon decides he wants to go after the rest of the children of this woman, and those children are identified as the saints of God who hold testimony about Jesus. Now, since the entire storyline of Revelation chapter 12 is taking place at midpoint of the final 7 years, and we know that because of the timing indicators that are given, that once the dragon and his angels are cast down, they only have 3.5 years left, which logically puts the war in heaven and its timing at the midpoint of the final 7 years. And at this midpoint time, the woman gave birth to the male child, and the child is caught up to God and to his throne. And I'll just briefly say that birth pains and the birth pains of this woman represent the persecution against God's people. And that'll give you a clue as to who the woman represents. But the birth of the child, focusing in on the birth for a moment, the New Testament uses birth as a symbol to represent resurrection. And if you just take a moment to dismantle the concept of Jesus being the firstborn from among the dead, you can see there that birth is symbolically being used of his resurrection, seeing he was the firstborn from among the dead. And when you apply that imagery to the birth of the male child, you can see that what's taking place in Revelation chapter 12 at midpoint, this birth is representing resurrection. And it's the resurrection of the dead saints and the rapture of the living saints that are still on the earth. And this is all taking place at midpoint. Now, there's a lot more to that imagery that could be added, and many scriptures that we could look at, and we will in future episodes, to back up that is in fact the way the book of Revelation is using this imagery. But typically this can't be seen from a lot of the other views, because views like pre-trib, pre-wrath, and the post-trib view do not see a resurrection happening at midpoint. And therefore, they never go down this road. In fact, they don't even see this road because it's not something that fits in with the timeline of events that they see happening. And so they typically go about interpreting this imagery a different way that they feel will be more consistent with their views. But I'll just say this, that in my experience, when they're confronted with the interpretation of this imagery from the standpoint of a midweek rapture position, they're kind of left scratching their head and a little bit dumbfounded, because it's obvious that they've never looked at this imagery in this way before, but then they can't really just put it to the wayside either, because the interpretation of the imagery from the midweek rapture position makes a lot of biblical and scriptural sense. So the way the midweek rapture view looks at Revelation chapter 12 is that the war in heaven is representing the end of the age, when Satan and his angels are going to be cast down. And the casting down is not speaking of a literal casting down like he's up in the air and he's going to be cast down to the earth literally. It's representing the removal of his position of authority over the kingdoms of the world. And from the very beginning, we see that Satan had unlawfully gotten a hold of a position of authority. And that's why that prophecy in Genesis 3:15 says that the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And it's not talking about his actual literal head. That's talking about his headship. It's talking about his place of authority, as Paul calls him, the God of the age. And so in Revelation 12, at the time of the war in heaven, the symbolism of the events that are being described is talking about the end of the age when Satan will be removed from that place of authority. That's what the casting down means. And at that time, as the announcement in verse 10 declares, the kingdom of God and the authority of his Christ, or Jesus, comes. And that happens at midpoint. And all of the dead saints are resurrected, and the living saints are caught up together with them. And this resurrection and catching away of the saints is represented in the birth symbolism, just like Jesus was the first born from among the dead, and that represented his resurrection. Now the saints of God are being born from the dead, which represent their resurrection. And this happens at midpoint. And then we get to the last two verses of Revelation chapter 12. And the dragon is standing on the sand of the sea. He's filled with wrath. He attempted to pursue the woman, but she is being protected and he can't get to her. So what does he do? He goes to make war on the rest of her children. Now, if the saints of God are caught up and resurrected at midpoint, who are the rest of her children? And from the midweek rapture position, the rest of her children are those who become the new saints of God at the time of Jesus' appearing, because the whole world will see him. And then many, hopefully billions of people around the world, once they see the Lord appear, will submit to Jesus and his new authority over the kingdoms of the world, because now the kingdom of God has come. And so he wants to make war with these new saints that now fill the earth. But there will be many people around the world who do not submit to Christ. And they were followers of all these different other religions, which now they know Allah isn't real, Buddha isn't real, and they're faced with having to make a major decision in their life all at once, because all the gods of the world that people thought were real gods, the people will know that they were worshiping false gods. And then you have verses that kind of speak to this, like the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And that gives you an idea of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord just sweeping across the land because of his appearing. And everybody will know the truth, but not everyone will receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. But some will receive the love of the truth, and those are who the dragon goes forth after midpoint to make war with, the rest of her children, the new saints. And so he's standing on the sand of the seashore, looking out over the sea, and he's waiting for this great sea monster to come up out of the sea. And as it has been, many interpreters have looked at this first beast and have identified this beast coming up out of the sea as being the Antichrist. But what I showed you in the last episode is that some of the description of this beast, like in verse 2, where it says, the beast that I saw was like a leopard, but its feet were like the feet of a bear, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And that imagery and that description is supposed to take us back to Daniel's vision of the four beasts that come up out of the sea as well. Yet in Daniel's vision, those beasts represented kingdoms, not individual kings of the kingdoms, but the kingdoms themselves. And so to stay true to the pattern of biblical imagery, when we look at this beast coming up out of the sea, we should maintain that same style of interpretation and say that the beast coming up out of the sea here in Revelation 13:1 is talking about a kingdom and not an individual. Now, this kingdom is representing the kingdom of the Antichrist, but this beast is not the Antichrist. It's representing the kingdom that he will be over. And then I also mentioned that in Revelation 17, that there is this same description of this beast who has the 7 heads and 10 horns. And over there in verse 8, it says that the beast that you saw was and is not, but is about to come up from the abyss. So we have the beast coming up out of the sea in Revelation 13:1, and then we have this same beast coming up out of the abyss in Revelation 17, verse 8. And we talked about biblical imagery and how in the Bible, the sea is used a lot of time to talk about the chaos of the nations, and that the imagery of the abyss is more spiritual in nature. And a lot of times when we see the abyss, we're seeing divine beings either coming up from the abyss or being locked in the abyss. And so we can see how the imagery of the beast coming up out of the abyss is talking about the divine being that is going to be over this earthly kingdom. So we have like a multifaceted understanding of this final kingdom. Number one, it's going to be an earthly kingdom. Number two, it's going to be influenced and controlled by a spiritual being that comes up out of the abyss. And that's the spiritual side of things. And then there's going to be an earthly king, which is the Antichrist. And we have all of this kind of happening and all of this imagery that's being displayed in the book of Revelation. But when we go back to Revelation 13, verse 1, it says that this beast had 10 horns, 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadem crowns. And here's where things get a little bit more complex. But when we look at verse 3, it says, one of the beast's heads appeared to have been killed, but the lethal wound had been healed, and the whole world followed after the beast in amazement. So it's not one of the horns that appeared to have been killed. It's one of the heads. And when we just go back over to Revelation 17 and we look in verse 9, it tells us a little bit more of what the heads actually represent. And just to acknowledge the difficulty of this, John says in a parenthetical statement, this requires a mind that has wisdom. In other words, this is tough. Now, John was not saying that only smart people can understand this. What he meant by here's the mind that has wisdom was that you're going to need a little bit of knowledge about history and the history of previous kingdoms in order to figure this one out. And fortunately, in today's world, that information is readily available. But he says the 7 heads are 7 mountains that the woman sits on, and they are also 7 kings. And everybody focuses on the words the woman sits on, and they try to speculate, oh, is this the 7 hills of Rome where the Vatican is and all this? And it gets off into all this crazy stuff. But most importantly, they lose focus, chasing down these rabbit trails. But let's stay focused here. It says the 7 heads are 7 mountains, and they are also 7 kings. And we could spend some time looking at mountain imagery in the Bible and what that means. And we're not going to do that right now, but mountains often represent kingdoms in the Bible. So if we just say the 7 heads are 7 kingdoms, and then add to that, they are also 7 kings, because we're talking here in Revelation 17 about the spiritual side of things. The 7 kings are talking about the 7 spiritual divine beings that were in authority over those previous kingdoms that existed. And again, we could use Daniel chapter 10 as a reference and to validate that way of thinking, because over there it shows us that specifically the kingdom of Persia and the kingdom of Greece had spiritual beings that the angel talking with Daniel and Michael the archangel had to deal with. But of these kingdoms, in verse 10, it says 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the one that is referring to the Roman Empire, and the other has not yet come, and this other one is talking about the kingdom of the Antichrist. But it says about this future Antichrist kingdom that when it comes, it must remain for only a brief time. And I think that what this is referring to is that the Antichrist during the first 3.5 years will be active and will be toppling 3 of the 10 kings during that first 3.5 years and beginning to assemble his kingdom. But that kingdom won't last very long, because when the Lord appears, that kingdom will have been coming against Israel to destroy Israel during the Great Tribulation leading up to midpoint. And then when the Lord comes, he will annihilate all of the armies that come against Israel at that time. That is why it says it must remain for only a brief time. But then it says in verse 11, the beast that was and is not is himself an 8th king, meaning that there isn't an 8th head that is assigned to this 8th king, but that the reason that there isn't an 8th head assigned to this 8th king is because it says, and yet he is one of the seven. And I would say he is the seventh, the one that was destroyed. And then after midpoint, that kingdom that he rules over survives and comes back. So when we take that information and we go back over to Revelation 13, it explains this imagery in verse 3, where it says, and one of the beast's heads appeared to have been killed. Now that is the seventh head, the one that is to come, that must only last a short while. But when Jesus comes and destroys the armies that are coming against Israel, that head will receive a lethal wound. And remember, heads represent kingdoms, as we saw over in Revelation 17. But that kingdom of the Antichrist that he was building during the first 3.5 years, that's going to be obliterated by the Lord at the coming of the Lord when he comes to protect Israel from the advance of the Antichrist that's coming from the north. Somehow we are supposed to understand that in the aftermath of that, the Antichrist survives and that his kingdom, which appeared to have been obliterated, somehow rises back up. And it says the whole world followed after the beast in amazement. And then they worshiped the dragon because he gave ruling authority to the beast, or to this kingdom, and the divine being that is behind it. And they worshiped the beast too, saying, who is like this beast? And who is able to make war against him? And I would say that when it says who is like this beast, it's talking about the kingdom itself. And of course, we know the background that there's a divine being that is supernaturally enabling this kingdom to rise at this time. And then it says in verse 5, the beast was given a mouth speaking proud words. And it's probably best to look at this as he was given a mouthpiece, a human representative that speaks on its behalf. And that human representative is the next beast, the beast that rises up out of the earth, which is the Antichrist himself. But as you can see in verse 7, it says that this beast, this kingdom of the Antichrist, was permitted to go to war against the saints and to conquer them, which is specifically related to what was happening at the end of Revelation chapter 12 with the dragon wanting to go to war with the saints. And he's going to use this revived kingdom of the Antichrist, this beast that rises up out of the sea, to go forth and make war against the saints. And then we get to verse 11 and we see this other beast coming up out of the earth. Now, if you've been around end time prophecy for any length of time, you've heard that, there's going to be a Antichrist and another man called the false prophet. And typically, the first beast coming up out of the sea has wrongly been identified as the Antichrist. And this beast coming up out of the earth has wrongly been identified as a secondary human being from the Antichrist. And this beast that's coming up out of the earth is the false prophet. And we know that from a verse later on in the book of Revelation, where the description makes it obvious that this earth beast is the false prophet. But he's not a different person than the Antichrist himself. The Antichrist is the false prophet. In other words, the book of Revelation identifies the Antichrist with another name, calling him the false prophet. Okay, now with establishing all of that background, we can finally get into looking at this earth beast. And in verse 11, it says, "Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but was speaking like a dragon." Now, we need to pause here and just kind of dissect this imagery for a moment, because a big mistake has been made in many of the translations when it comes to the word lamb. Because in the Greek language, the word used here is arnion, and it does mean lamb, as in referring to sheep, but there is something specific about this particular arnion and the information that we're given about it that should automatically tell the translator that it should not be translated as the word lamb, but the word ram, because it said he had 2 horns. And because of this context, the translations should read like a ram. But in spite of this, most translations render the word lamb here because they're trying to maintain a connection between this, what they call false lamb, and what we see earlier on in the book of Revelation concerning the true lamb, which we know is Jesus. But that is an interpretive decision on the part of the translator, and they have no business doing that in this verse because the context should overrule that. And since it says he had two horns, it should say like a ram. But if you look in your translation, most likely it says lamb. And what this has caused is people to immediately think, oh, this is the opposite of Jesus. This is like a false lamb that's going to present itself as a lamb, and has caused wild ideas like the Antichrist is going to come to Israel as a false Messiah, and Israel is going to accept this individual as the Messiah and create a false peace. And then the whole idea of a peace treaty kind of emerges out of this in some circles. And none of that was intended by this passage. None of it. And it's all because of a mistranslation. This verse should read like this. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had two horns like a ram, but he was speaking like a dragon. And then they look at the word but, and it appears to be like opposite. He was like a lamb, but was speaking like a dragon. Like, oh, he's real innocent, but in reality, he's not. However, the word but in Greek is simply the word kai, and that word can be translated as and, also, even, or yet, or but. And so you can see here how the translators, because they're trying to contrast this particular arnion, this ram, which they translate as lamb, with the lamb who is Jesus, they then decide, and it is just a decision, to translate the next word kai as but, to continue this contrast, this idea. But it's a theological idea that they're inserting in here, and that has no business being in here. So the verse should read, he had two horns like a ram and was speaking like a dragon. Now, what is usually overlooked here is what is the imagery of these two horns trying to bring out. And the horns of a ram are used by the ram to fight other rams and to exert their dominance. I mean, just think of the Ram automobile, and you remember seeing the commercials where you've got these two rams like button heads. That's the imagery that's intended here. The two horns like a ram is signifying that this beast will be aggressive and will rise up in opposition. And that is exactly what the Antichrist will do. Then it goes on in verse 12. He exercised all the ruling authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and those who inhabit it worship the first beast, the one whose lethal wound had been healed. And of course, as the leader of this kingdom that rises in the aftermath of the appearing of the Lord, he will make the people of the nations submit to his authority and the authority of his kingdom. And then notice verse 13. He performed momentous signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And this should make it so obvious that this is talking about the Antichrist and not a separate individual who is a false prophet, but that the Antichrist and the false prophet are one and the same. Because Paul gave us the description of the Antichrist over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. And what the Antichrist will do, and he says that the arrival of the lawless one will be by Satan's working with all kinds of miracles and signs and false wonders. The Antichrist is the one who's going to be doing the miracles, signs, and false wonders. And in Revelation 13, the beast that rises from the earth, it says in verse 13, he performed momentous signs, even making fire come down from heaven to the earth in front of people. And by the signs he was permitted to perform on behalf of the beast, and he's talking about on behalf of his kingdom, and also the divine being that's behind all of this activity, he deceives those who live on the earth. And he told those who live on the earth to make an image to the beast who had been wounded by the sword but still lived. And this is probably an image of some sort that is like an icon or a display of some sort, or an emblem that represents his kingdom. And this will be some sort of a physical representation of that particular kingdom. We don't know what that kingdom is going to be called, but we do have an idea of where that kingdom will rise out of, and it is the old Assyrian Empire, that territory, which encompasses a lot of modern-day Turkey and Syria and parts of Iraq and Iran. And so, as you can see, without getting into all the weird speculation and sensationalism that usually surrounds these topics within the book of Revelation, the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, and there's so many things that people get carried away with. And part of the reason is the tendency to try to find the interpretation of these prophecies going outside of the Word of God into like modern technology and all these things, and trying to insert or imagine those things and how they might play out. And we don't need to do any of that. And so the first beast that comes up out of the sea is the kingdom of the Antichrist that is being supernaturally energized by an evil divine being behind the scenes. And that's completely and totally biblical. And that the second beast, the one that comes up out of the earth, is the Antichrist figure who will do lying signs and wonders and be the human representation of that final kingdom that will go forth to persecute the saints and to make war with the saints during the last 3.5 years. And then ultimately, during the last 3.5 years, will spearhead a coalition of nations, starting with the 10 kings that will submit to him and give their power and authority to him. And then beyond that, to all the nations of the world who will come at the end of the 7 years to make war with Jesus the Lamb. But the Lamb will overcome him at the Battle of Armageddon.